It was past midnight in a New York recording studio when Bob Dylan asked Johnny Cash the question that would hang in the air between them for the rest of their lives. The studio was nearly empty. The session musicians had packed up hours ago. The producer had left around 11. Now it was just the two of them in the control room, smoke curling up from Dylan's cigarette, the city outside the window reduced to distant lights and silence. Cash was sitting on the couch with his guitar across his lap. Dylan was leaning against the mixing console, his face half in shadow. They'd been talking for an hour, maybe more, about music, about the business, about what it meant to keep going when the world wanted something from you that you weren't sure you had anymore. Dylan had been pulling away from folk music for months. The purists hated him for it. They called him a traitor, a sellout. But Dylan didn't care about the purists. He cared about the truth, or at least his version of it. And lately, that truth had been leading him somewhere else. Cash was in a different kind of transition. His prison concerts had made him famous in a new way. Folsom Prison Blues was everywhere. People saw him as a voice for the forgotten, the incarcerated, the broken. But his personal life was a mess. He was using pills to get through the day. His marriage was falling apart. And every time he stood on a stage and sang about redemption, a part of him wondered if he had any right to the words. They'd been circling something for the past 20 minutes, something neither of them had said directly. Then Dylan set his cigarette in the ashtray and looked at Cash. "John," Dylan said quietly, "I want to ask you something, but you don't have to answer if you don't want to." Cash looked up. "What's that?" Dylan didn't rush. He let the silence settle first. This question wasn't casual. It was something Dylan had been carrying for a while, something he'd wanted to ask but wasn't sure Cash could handle, or maybe he wasn't sure he himself could handle Cash's answer. "Do you actually believe what you sing?" Cash's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the room. Dylan continued, his voice still calm, not accusing. "I mean, when you sing about faith, about God, about redemption, do you believe it? Or are you just saying the right words?" Cash didn't respond immediately. He set his guitar down slowly, leaning it against the arm of the couch. Then he reached for his own cigarette and lit it, his hands steady. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20. What Bob asked wasn't an accusation. It was a mirror. Dylan didn't push. He just waited. He knew that if Cash deflected, if he gave some rehearsed answer about faith being complicated or personal, then Dylan would have his real answer. But if Cash actually sat with the question, actually let it land, then maybe something true would come out. Cash took a drag from his cigarette and exhaled slowly. He looked at the floor, then at the ceiling, then finally at Dylan. "Sometimes," Cash said quietly. Dylan's expression didn't change, but he was listening now in a way that went deeper than before. "Sometimes I believe every word," Cash continued. "Sometimes I sing those songs and I feel it all the way through. I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, saying exactly what needs to be said." He paused. "And sometimes I'm just trying to hold on." The room went completely still. Cash didn't answer, and that was the answer Dylan didn't expect. Cash looked down at his hands. "There are nights when I stand on a stage and sing about being saved, about grace, about God's love, and I mean it, I really do. But then I walk off that stage and I take a pill to get through the next hour, and I wonder if anything I just said was real." Dylan didn't interrupt. "I sing about prisons," Cash said, "about men who are locked up and forgotten. And I care about those men. I really do. But I also know that I get to leave. I get to go back to a hotel, sleep in a bed, wake up free. And sometimes I wonder if I'm using their pain to make myself feel like I matter." This wasn't a confession to a priest. This was one artist admitting to another that the line between performance and belief wasn't as clear as people thought. "So no,"
said Cash finally. "I don't always believe what I sing, but I never sing something I think is a lie." Dylan absorbed that. He didn't nod, he didn't offer reassurance. He just let the words sit there. This wasn't about belief, it was about honesty. Cash looked at Dylan. "What about you? Do you believe what you sing?" Dylan almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was the right question to ask back. "I don't believe in words, John," Dylan said. "I carve them out and see what's underneath. Sometimes I find something true. Sometimes I just find more words." Cash considered that. "So you don't worry about whether people believe you?" "I worry about whether I'm lying to myself. If I'm lying to myself, then the song's already dead. But if I'm honest, even if I'm wrong, at least it's real." Cash nodded slowly. "That's different from what I'm doing." "Maybe. Or maybe we're both doing the same thing from different directions."
They sat in silence for a while. The city outside hummed quietly. The studio felt like a confessional booth, dim and private and removed from the world. Finally, Cash spoke again. "You know what scares me?" he said. "It's not that I might not believe what I sing. It's that I might start believing it just because I've said it so many times." Dylan looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if you perform something long enough, it starts to feel true even if it isn't. You say the words so many times that they become part of you, and then you don't know anymore if you believed it first or if the performance created the belief." Dylan leaned forward slightly. "And you think that's what's happening to you?" Cash hesitated. "I think it might be. Some people sing what they believe. Others believe what they sing." Cash was doing neither. Cash stubbed out his cigarette. "When I sing about God, about faith, about being saved, part of me means it, but part of me is just hoping that if I say it enough times, it'll become true, like I can sing my way into belief." "And is it working?" Dylan asked. Cash looked at him. "I don't know yet." Dylan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's the most honest thing you've said all night." Cash almost laughed, but it came out more like a sigh. "You asked an honest question, figured you deserved an honest answer. Most people wouldn't give it. Most people don't get asked by Bob Dylan at midnight in a recording studio." Dylan did smile at that, just slightly. "Fair point." They fell into silence again. But it was a different kind of silence. Not uncomfortable, just heavy with the weight of what had been said. After a while, Dylan spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "You know what the difference is between you and most of the people singing about God?" Cash looked at him. "What?" "You're not selling it. You're wrestling with it." Cash frowned. "I'm not sure that's better." "It's not better, but it's real, and people can feel the difference." Cash thought about that. "Do you think people know when someone's faking it?" "Not always, but they know when someone's not." The question Dylan had asked wasn't just about Johnny Cash. It was about every performer who stood on a stage and offered something to an audience. Hope, belief, redemption, truth. And the question underneath the question was this: how much of what you give is real, and how much is just what people need to hear? Cash didn't have a clean answer, and that bothered him more than the question itself. "I'll tell you something, Bob," Cash said. "If I had to believe every word I sing, I'd have stopped singing years ago. Because some days, I don't believe in much of anything. Some days, I'm just trying to get through the next hour without falling apart." He paused. "But I do know this. I've never stood on a stage and sold something I knew was a lie. I've never sung about faith like it's a product I'm trying to move.
If I sing about God, it's because I'm looking for God, not because I've found him and want to sell you the map." Dylan nodded slowly. "That's the difference between a hymn and a commercial." "Exactly. But what if you never find him?" Dylan asked. "What if you keep singing about faith and you never actually get there?" Cash met his eyes. "Then at least I was honest about the search." Dylan looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Yeah, I guess that's enough." Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The conversation had gone as far as it could go. They'd both said things they couldn't take back, admitted things they wouldn't admit to most people. Finally, Cash stood up and picked up his guitar. "I should get going. It's late." Dylan nodded. "Yeah." Cash walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "Bob," he said, "thanks for asking." "For asking what?" "That question. Most people don't. Most people don't want the real answer. And you did? I wanted to know if you were the same guy on stage that you are off it." Cash thought about that. "And what do you think?" Dylan looked at him, his face unreadable. "I think you're trying to be, and that's harder than just performing." Cash nodded. "See you around." "See you around, John." Cash left the studio and walked out into the New York night. The streets were empty. The city felt bigger and quieter than it had any right to be. He thought about Dylan's question the entire walk back to his hotel. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he did, and the answer made him uncomfortable. He didn't always believe what he sang, but he wanted to. And maybe that was the point. Maybe faith wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was about being honest enough to admit when you didn't. 3 years later, Johnny Cash recorded Live at Folsom Prison. The album became one of the most iconic records of his career. When he sang Folsom Prison Blues in front of those inmates, the performance was raw, real, unpolished, and people felt it. A journalist asked him later if he felt like he was exploiting the prisoners by recording there.
Cash thought about it for a long time before answering. Then he said, "I don't sing for those men because I understand what they're going through. I sing for them because I don't. And maybe that's more honest than pretending I do." The journalist didn't understand what he meant, but Bob Dylan would have. In 1969, Dylan released Nashville Skyline, an album that confused a lot of his fans because it was softer, more traditional, less angry than what they expected. Johnny Cash appeared on the album, singing a duet with Dylan on Girl from the North Country. When they recorded it, they didn't talk about that night in the studio 5 years earlier. They didn't need to. They both knew what had been said, what had been admitted. And when they sang together, there was something in their voices that people couldn't quite name. It wasn't perfectly harmonized, it wasn't polished, but it was real. Because both of them had stopped trying to perform belief. They were just trying to be honest. And that was harder. And that was enough. Years later, a biographer asked Bob Dylan about his friendship with Johnny Cash. The biographer wanted to know what made their connection different from Dylan's relationships with other musicians. Dylan thought about it for a while. Then he said, "John didn't lie to me, and I didn't lie to him. That's rare." The biographer pressed, "But you must have disagreed about things. Faith, for instance. You came from very different places." "We did," Dylan said, "but disagreeing and lying aren't the same thing. John believed in God, or he was trying to. I wasn't sure what I believed, but we were both honest about where we were, and that mattered more than having the same answers." The biographer asked if Dylan ever regretted asking Cash that question, whether he believed what he sang. Dylan smiled slightly. No, because he answered it, and most people wouldn't have. What did his answer tell you? That he was real, that he wasn't performing faith, he was living with it. and sometimes living with something is harder than believing in it. Johnny Cash never spoke publicly about that conversation in the studio. But in his later years, when he was asked about the relationship between faith and performance, he always said the same thing. I don't think you can separate who you are from what you sing, but I also don't think you have to believe every word to make it true. Sometimes, the act of saying something, of putting it out into the world, is how you figure out if you believe it. He paused. And if you never believe it, then at least you were honest about trying.
That night in the New York studio became one of those moments that shaped both of them, even though nobody else knew it happened. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a fight. It was just two men asking each other the kind of questions most people are too afraid to ask. Do you believe what you sing? It's a simple question, but the answer is never simple. Because belief isn't static. It changes, it grows, it fades. And if you're honest, you admit that some days you have it and some days you don't. Johnny Cash admitted that, and Bob Dylan respected him for it. Not because Cash had all the answers, but because he was willing to admit when he didn't. And in a world full of performers selling certainty, that kind of honesty was the rarest thing of all.